Have you ever wondered when the absolute worst time in history to be born as a human was? We often romanticize the past, but let's dive into an era where simply existing was a daily struggle, a gamble against disease, famine, and brutal conflict. Forget the dinosaurs. We're talking about a period where humanity truly faced its darkest hours. The 14th century, a perfect storm of misery. Imagine being born in Europe, sometime between 1300 and 1400. Sounds quaint, right? Wrong. This was a century that piled catastrophe upon catastrophe, creating a truly hellish existence for the vast majority. The Great Famine, 1315 to 1317. Your first few years of life would likely be defined by gnawing hunger. The 14th century kicked off with the Great Famine. A shift in weather patterns brought relentless rain and cold, leading to widespread crop failures across northern Europe. This wasn't just a bad harvest, it was years of successive failures. People ate their seed grain, slaughtered their draft animals, and resorted to desperate measures. Diseases like pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis thrived in weakened populations. Child mortality rates, already shockingly high, skyrocketed. If you survived infancy, you were already among the lucky few, but your body would be permanently scarred by malnutrition, making you susceptible to whatever came next. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351. Just as the continent was starting to recover from the famine, an invisible killer arrived, the Black Death. This isn't just a historical event, it was a demographic apocalypse. Carried by fleas on rats, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, wiping out an estimated 30 to 50% of the population in just a few short years. Imagine your village, your town, your family. One day, people are there. The next, they're developing painful swellings, fever, and then death, often within days. There was no understanding of germ theory, no effective treatments. People believed it was divine punishment, bad air, or even a conspiracy. Mass graves became a common sight. Society crumbled under the weight of death and fear. If you were born before the plague, you likely witnessed unimaginable suffering and loss. If you were born during it, your chances of survival were slim to none. Even if you survived the initial wave, subsequent outbreaks continued for decades. Constant warfare and social unrest. As if famine and plague weren't enough, the 14th century was also characterized by relentless warfare and social upheaval. The 100 Years' War between England and France raged for over a century, devastating vast swathes of land, conscripting men, and leaving a trail of destruction. But it wasn't just large-scale conflicts. Local lords fought over territory, bandits roamed the land, and peasant revolts, fueled by desperation and injustice, were common. Life for a commoner meant constant threat of violence, displacement, and the ever-present demand for taxes and resources to fund these endless conflicts. Your family's meager harvest could be seized, your village pillaged, and your sons conscripted into brutal armies. A world without modern comforts or knowledge. Beyond the dramatic events, consider the everyday realities. There was no effective medicine, no understanding of hygiene. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and child. Most people lived in squalor, without sanitation or clean water. Education was a luxury for the elite. Superstition and fear governed much of daily life. Why the 14th century stands out. While other periods had their own horrors, the world wars, the early ice ages, genocides, the 14th century in Europe presents a unique confluence of global-scale disaster. It wasn't just one event, it was a relentless onslaught of famine, plague, and war that simultaneously devastated a continent, leaving its survivors in a broken world. The sheer scale of demographic collapse from the Black Death, combined with prolonged environmental and political instability, made it a truly unparalleled period of human suffering. So, the next time you're feeling down about modern life, spare a thought for the poor souls born in the 14th century. Their existence was a stark reminder of humanity's fragility in the face of nature's wrath and its own destructive tendencies. What do you think was the worst time in history to be alive, and why? Let me know in the comments. If you thought the 14th century was bad, you're only scratching the surface of its insidious aftershocks. Being born after the initial wave of the Black Death, yet still within that tumultuous century, presented its own unique brand of misery. The world you'd inherit was one forever scarred, a landscape of echoes and changed realities. The long shadow of the Black Death, a scarred world. Imagine surviving the plague's initial fury, only to live in a world grappling with its profound and terrifying consequences. This wasn't a quick recovery, it was a slow, painful, and often violent reshaping of society. A world of ghosts and ruin. Your childhood would be spent in a land haunted by absence. Villages lay deserted, fields lay fallow, and once bustling towns were eerily quiet. The sheer number of dead meant a drastic reduction in the workforce, leading to abandoned farms and decaying infrastructure. The air would be thick with the stench of grief and the lingering fear of the plague's return, which it did, in terrifying waves, for centuries to come. You might grow up seeing repeated outbreaks, each one a grim reminder of the first, adding to the constant anxiety and uncertainty of life. The breakdown of society and authority. The plague shattered the existing social order. The feudal system, already creaking, buckled under the weight of mass death. With fewer peasants, labor became a precious commodity. This should have empowered the survivors, but the ruling classes, desperate to maintain their power and wealth, fought back. Imagine being a peasant or a burgeoning artisan in this era. You might demand higher wages, better conditions, or even freedom from serfdom. But the lords and kings would respond with harsh laws, like England's Statute of Labourers, attempting to cap wages and force people back into their old roles. This clash of wills often led to violent peasant revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England or the Jacquerie in France. If you were born into a peasant family, you might find yourself caught between the hammer of aristocratic repression and the anvil of revolutionary fervor, fighting for basic rights with no guarantee of success, and facing brutal retribution if you failed. Economic chaos and inequality. The economic impact was a double-edged sword. While some surviving peasants and skilled labourers might find themselves in a better bargaining position due to labour shortages, this was often offset by rampant inflation and a general economic downturn in many areas. Trade routes were disrupted, markets fluctuated wildly, and traditional industries suffered. Furthermore, the initial blow of the plague, while seemingly leveling the playing field by killing rich and poor alike, often led to a concentration of wealth in the hands of those who survived and were astute enough to consolidate resources. Large landowners might struggle, but the savvy few who could adapt and exploit the new labor market, or those who inherited vast estates due to widespread death, could prosper. This meant that while some avenues for social mobility opened up, the underlying structures of inequality could still persist, and even intensify, for many. A profoundly changed cultural and spiritual landscape. The cultural impact of the Black Death was immense and deeply morbid. Art and literature became preoccupied with death, decay, and the fragility of life. The Danse Macabre, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves, became a pervasive motif. People grappled with existential questions. Why had God allowed this? Was it divine punishment? The authority of the Church, which had promised salvation and guidance, was deeply shaken. Many priests died, and those who remained often struggled to provide answers or comfort. This led to a surge in mysticism, flagellant movements, where people publicly whipped themselves to atone for sins, and a questioning of traditional religious doctrines. If you were growing up in this era, your spiritual beliefs would be profoundly shaped by this pervasive sense of doom and uncertainty. You might witness intense piety alongside cynical hedonism, as people adopted a live-for-today mentality in the face of inevitable death. Persistent insecurity and a bleak outlook. Ultimately, being born in the latter half of the 14th century meant growing up in a world that felt perpetually broken. The psychological toll of living through such a catastrophe, knowing that it could always return, would be immense. Life expectancy remained low, disease was rampant, and violence was never far away. The hope and optimism of earlier centuries were replaced by a grim resignation. While the Black Death ultimately contributed to the decline of feudalism and the eventual rise of new social and economic structures that would lead to the Renaissance, for those living through it, it was a time of unparalleled suffering, fear, and uncertainty. The worst part wasn't just dying in the 14th century, it was living through it, knowing the world you inherited was a graveyard and an ongoing battlefield. So, we've explored the immediate hell of the 14th century and its lingering shadow. But what about the periods after the Black Death, where its echoes still resonated, combined with new threats? Let's venture into a time where advancements were made, but survival was far from guaranteed, and new forms of human cruelty emerged. The age of exploration and early modernity, new horizons, new horrors. While often lauded as a time of discovery and progress, the centuries following the 14th, particularly the 15th, 16th, and 17th, presented a unique set of dangers for those born into them. The world was expanding, but so too was the capacity for human suffering on an unprecedented scale. The return of the plague and other diseases. Just because the initial Black Death had passed didn't mean the threat was gone. 4 centuries after, outbreaks of plague, smallpox, typhus, and other devastating diseases were a regular occurrence. Major cities would be hit repeatedly, leading to quarantines, social disruption, and sudden death. Imagine being born in London in the late 16th or early 17th century. You would live with the constant dread of the plague carts, the bring out your dead cries, and the sight of houses marked with a red cross, signaling infection within. While medical knowledge was slowly advancing, effective treatments were still a long way off. Your chances of reaching adulthood were still precarious, even without the immediate threat of the 14th century's perfect storm. The brutality of religious wars. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in the 16th century, shattered the religious unity of Europe and plunged the continent into centuries of horrific religious wars. This wasn't just about theological debates, it was about power, land, and the very soul of nations. The French Wars of Religion, late 16th century decades of brutal conflict, marked by massacres like the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where thousands of Huguenots, Protestants, were slaughtered. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, perhaps the most devastating conflict in European history before the World Wars. It ravaged Central Europe, leading to the death of an estimated 4 to 8 million people from combat, famine, and disease. Entire regions were depopulated, cities burned, and agricultural land laid waste. If you were born in what is now Germany during this period, your life would be a constant nightmare of marching armies, pillaging soldiers, and starvation. Neutrals were rare, everyone was forced to choose a side, often facing death for the wrong allegiance. These wars weren't just about armies clashing, they involved widespread destruction of civilian populations, systematic rape, torture, and the deliberate targeting of non-combatants in the name of God. The horrors of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. While Europe was tearing itself apart, it was also embarking on a new, darker chapter: global colonialism. 4 indigenous populations in the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia, being born during this period was a catastrophic curse. 4 indigenous Americans. The arrival of Europeans brought not only conquest and violence but also devastating diseases like smallpox, to which native populations had no immunity. Entire civilizations were decimated. If you were born into an Aztec, Inca, or North American tribe in the 16th century, your world would be violently overthrown, your culture suppressed, and your people enslaved or systematically killed. For Africans, the transatlantic slave trade ramped up dramatically in these centuries. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes, packed into disease-ridden slave ships in the Middle Passage, and subjected to unimaginable brutality and lifelong servitude in the Americas. If you were born in West Africa and captured during this period, your life was effectively over as a free human being. The psychological and physical scars of this institution would last for generations. The witch hunts. Adding another layer of terror, the early modern period saw the peak of the witch hunts. Fueled by religious fervor, superstition, and social anxieties, tens of thousands of, mostly, women were accused of witchcraft, tortured, and executed across Europe and its colonies. Imagine living in a small village where a bad harvest or a child's illness could lead to your mother, sister, or neighbor being accused, put on trial, and burned at the stake. Fear and paranoia were pervasive, and anyone could become a target. Why these centuries also qualify for worst time? While the 14th century was a sudden, apocalyptic shock, the subsequent centuries represent a more prolonged and widespread horror, marked by persistent disease. The plague and other epidemics continued to stalk populations. Ideological warfare. The rise of religious fanaticism led to unprecedented levels of organized, systematic brutality against fellow humans. Globalized suffering. European expansion unleashed unimaginable suffering on non-European populations through conquest, disease, and the institution of slavery. Being born into the 15th, 16th, or 17th century meant navigating a world where progress in some areas was tragically offset by brutal warfare, pervasive disease, and new forms of human-on-human cruelty that spanned continents. It highlights that even as humanity gained knowledge and expanded its reach, its capacity for inflicting pain on itself and others grew exponentially. What do you think is the worst part of living in these early modern centuries? We've journeyed through the immediate horrors of the 14th century and the brutal expansion of the early modern period. But what about the times when humanity's innovations, rather than natural disasters, became the primary architects of widespread suffering? Let's consider the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, eras marked by explosive population growth, unprecedented industrialization, and ultimately, global conflict on a scale never before seen. The Industrial Age and beyond. Progress with a perilous price. Imagine being born into a world rapidly transforming, where the promise of progress often meant being ground under the heel of new economic systems and the escalating machinery of war. The urban slums and industrial misery. The late 18th and 19th centuries saw the Industrial Revolution explode. People flocked from rural areas to burgeoning cities in search of work, creating unprecedented urban sprawl. But this wasn't the clean, organized cityscape we know today. If you were born into a working-class family in a major industrial hub like Manchester, London, or New York, your early life would be defined by squalor, disease, and relentless toil. Families were crammed into overcrowded tenements, often sharing single rooms, with open sores running through the streets. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis ripped through these populations with terrifying efficiency. Children as young as 5 or 6 were sent to work in factories, mines, and mills, enduring long hours, dangerous conditions, and brutal discipline. Limbs were lost to machinery, lungs were choked with coal dust or textile fibers, and childhood was a luxury few could afford. The air was thick with smog, the water polluted, and the promise of a better life often a cruel mirage. Your existence would be a grim cycle of work, poverty, and the constant threat of illness or industrial accident. Imperialism's darkest hour and famines. While European powers industrialized, they simultaneously intensified their global reach, leading to the zenith of imperialism. 4 vast swathes of the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, being born under colonial rule meant subjugation, exploitation, and often, engineered famine. In British-ruled India, for example, several devastating famines occurred in the late 19th century, exacerbated by British policies that prioritized cash crops for export over local food security. Millions died. If you were born in colonial Africa, your land might be seized, your resources exploited, and your people subjected to forced labor or violent suppression by European powers. The notorious Belgian Congo under King Leopold II, where millions died from forced labor, mutilation, and atrocities, stands as a horrific example of this period's darkest side. The rise of total war and mass atrocity. The early 20th century then delivered a punch to the gut that no one could have truly anticipated: World War I. This wasn't just another conflict, it was the birth of total war, where entire nations were mobilized and the lines between combatant and civilian blurred. Imagine being a young man born in Europe in the late 1890s. By your late teens or early 20s, you'd be conscripted into the trenches, a nightmarish landscape of mud, disease, rats, poison gas, and relentless artillery barrages. Millions died, not just from bullets but from dysentery, influenza, and the sheer psychological torment. Those who survived were often permanently scarred, physically and mentally. And just as the world reeled from World War I, the seeds were sown for even greater horrors. The Russian Revolution and Civil War, a brutal conflict that followed the collapse of the Tsarist regime, leading to widespread famine and political purges. The Great Depression, a global economic collapse that plunged millions into poverty, despair, and unemployment, setting the stage for political extremism. The lead-up to World War II, The rise of fascism, Nazism, and aggressive militarism created an atmosphere of pervasive fear and escalating violence, culminating in a conflict that would claim tens of millions of lives. The cumulative burden. What makes these centuries particularly grim for a hypothetical birth is the cumulative burden. You had escaped the immediate, raw devastation of the Black Death, but you were now entering a world where human-made suffering scaled up. Industrialization, while offering progress, created new forms of poverty, exploitation, and dehumanization. Warfare became industrialized. The efficiency of killing reached horrifying new levels, with chemical weapons, machine guns, and aerial bombardments. Global interconnectedness spread suffering. Famines, conflicts, and economic downturns could now affect entire continents, not just isolated regions. So, while we enjoy many benefits from these eras, being born into them, particularly in the lower echelons of society or in colonized lands, meant facing unprecedented challenges orchestrated by human hands. It was a time when the very engines of progress often became instruments of widespread misery. What are your thoughts on which of these eras truly stands out as the worst to be born? We've journeyed through centuries of human suffering, from the raw biological terror of the 14th century to the industrialized misery and global conflicts of the early 20th. We've seen how nature, disease, and human cruelty have all taken their turn in making life a living hell. So, with all that in mind, what truly was the absolute worst time in history to be born as a human? The verdict: a confluence of catastrophe. While every era had its unique horrors, and individual experiences varied wildly, if we're looking for a period where the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against a human being from birth, where survival was a daily gamble against multiple, compounding threats, the answer remains the 14th century in Europe. Here's why it often stands above other contenders. 1. The sheer scale of demographic collapse. The Black Death was not just a major epidemic, it was a demographic apocalypse of unprecedented scale. Unlike wars, which are often localized, or famines, which can be regional, the plague swept across an entire continent, wiping out a staggering 30 to 50% of the population in just a few short years. No other single event in recorded history caused such rapid and widespread loss of life. Being born into this era meant a statistically terrifying chance of not surviving your childhood or witnessing your entire family and community vanish. 2. A perfect storm of uncontrollable forces. The 14th century wasn't just about the plague. It was a triple threat of immense, uncontrollable forces. The Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, already weakening populations through starvation and malnutrition before the plague even arrived. This wasn't a one-off bad harvest, but years of environmental shifts leading to widespread crop failure. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351, and subsequent waves, the most devastating pandemic in human history. Constant warfare and social upheaval. The 100 Years' War, local conflicts, and desperate peasant revolts created a state of perpetual insecurity, violence, and economic instability. Unlike later periods where some form of centralized government or scientific understanding offered some mitigation, the 14th century offered almost none. People were truly at the mercy of forces they couldn't comprehend or combat.